to an amazing video. Take a listen.
Got away, incoming! Get him up!
This is the shocking video that comes out of Washington. The U.S. Coast Guard rescued 2 boaters after their boat became disabled near the San Juan Islands in Washington Monday night. Now, the Coast Guard received a mayday call via VHF radio and immediately dispatched a rescue boat to locate those individuals. Once the crew began the rescue mission, the boat unfortunately ran aground, sending its passengers into the cold water. The Coast Guard successfully recovered both individuals, but unfortunately, one of the passengers was declared deceased after succumbing to her injuries. So joining me now with some more insight on that rescue is Scott McAroo. He's the Chief of Response for the U.S. Coast Guard. Scott, thank you so much for being with us. Can you walk us through the steps that your team takes during a rescue operation like that, from receiving the distress call to completing the mission? Because from that vantage point, it was so dark and it was so treacherous. I mean, you only really had a spotlight to be able to find these individuals.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, first I'd like to just extend my deepest sympathies to the family of the victim. These cases are always challenging, and this one was especially challenging given the conditions. We had what's known as Fraser River outflow winds occurring in the area, which is this cold air blowing down the Fraser River from Canada. So it's much colder in Washington right now than it normally would be, and we were experiencing temps in the low 20s, snow periodically through the area. So some really bad conditions. What we do, we received this call, but we couldn't actually communicate with the boat ourselves. So the Canadian Coast Guard was actually relaying communications for us. They said that Mayday, which is the international distress signal, and they couldn't control the sailboat, weren't able to make way, and we call that being beset by weather. So we launched from our command center in Seattle, one of our rescue boats from our station in Bellingham. And when they got on scene, the conditions were just too much for us to be able to get the boat physically in tow. So we then sent a helicopter out to attempt to hoist the individuals. And as we were trying to figure out how to hoist them with that mast swinging back and forth, all the while the vessel had their sails up. So they were continuing to make way just at the will of the wind. And winds were 25 to 30 knots, seas 4 to 6 and up to 8 foot.
Scott, I want to ask you about that. I want to ask you about that aspect with the wind before we move on, because when you look at the wave interaction, right, that makes it so treacherous for you, as you had said, to get the boat to tow it. What is the threshold for a helicopter? Because I imagine trying to coordinate that at night with a helicopter and harsh winds, you must be wobbling around, and then you have to get them out. Is there a threshold or a parameter for the wind where it becomes almost too much?
Yeah, the winds were within the helicopter's parameters. The real concern there is when that mast is swinging back and forth, you can't just hoist directly to the vessel. So the hoist cable, and you endanger tangling that hoist cable in the vessel. And really, the people getting in the water is a last resort. The last thing you wanted, water temperature in the high 40s, air temps in the low 20s. So, yeah, we were within wind parameters, but certainly a challenging situation.
And Scott, one more question here. When you're looking at all the activity out west, we know as forecasters in atmospheric river, for you and your team, I know you guys see these events all the time. Is there kind of a communication outline where, like, look, if there is something that happens, this is what we're going to go through, kind of that training and equipment that's on standby in case something like this happens during one of the storms?
Yeah, it's funny. I like to describe the weather in the Pacific Northwest. It's pretty extreme. Things that would be a national news hurricane or tropical storm on the East Coast is just Tuesday on the Washington coast. And our crews out here are trained to operate in those harsh conditions. And we're actually the home here in the state of Washington to the Coast Guard's National Motor Lifeboat School, the world's foremost heavy weather surf and heavy weather boat operations training school, as well as the Coast Guard's Advanced Helicopter Rescue School, where we deploy our rescue swimmers into surf, up to 20-foot surf on the Columbia River Bar. So our crews are trained for it. We wear personal protective equipment, dry suits to keep us, dry and warm in those extreme conditions. But lots of challenges in circumstances like this with icing conditions when you have spray blowing and below freezing temperatures. We're concerned with topside icing on the boat, as well as icing conditions for the helicopters.
Scott, I worked out west for 3 years, and I know what you mean. When you get those atmospheric rivers setting up, especially out of the North Pacific, that is when it gets treacherous. And you alluded to these training and the skills with the boating. We're going to have to stay in contact when we get some fair weather. Maybe talk to you a little bit more about that with the Coast Guard's impressive there. Scott McGrew, Chief of the Response for the U.S. Coast Guard, thank you so much for your time tonight here on Fox Weather.